I found myself during the Second World War as an officer in the ATS in Egypt. And these were very formidable years in the history of the world and the Middle East, and I became very, very interested in Middle Eastern affairs, and this is, as you will recall, on the eve of our own independence. And when I heard that they were opening a school for diplomats, I applied for it. This was 46, 2 years before the State of Israel ever came into being. And there we were, 25 people, 20 men, 5 women. We were to have trained for 18 months, but then our own war of independence broke out, and we were taken out of the school and put back into military service for the second time in the life of most of us. And I was in Jerusalem during the siege, second in command of the women. And when that came to a happy end, I found myself in the foreign ministry.
You say you were taught to be a diplomat. How on earth can you be taught? What are the important things to remember?
I think it's the most difficult thing to teach a diplomat, because I would say that first one has to have the personality for it and the like for it. One has to like people and like the international chess play, if there is such a thing, because there is an interplay all the time. One has to be communicative. Now, in our particular case, we learned a great deal about the history of the Middle East. We learned a great deal about Zionist history of the Jewish people, archaeology, economics. We ourselves demanded that they teach us dancing and driving a car and using a typewriter. And they taught us some things that we thought were very silly and which we've discovered to have been terribly important, such as the history of the churches in the Middle East. This is one of our major preoccupations now. We find that there are churches of so many varieties in Jerusalem and in the area east of Jerusalem nobody had ever heard of, so it is good that we at least can differentiate to some degree one from the other. So I think one needs in diplomacy basically a personality, and secondly a very rounded knowledge. It's very true what they say, that you know less and less about more and more, unfortunately.
It's a little like our job, I suppose, in a way. You're required to know a little of everything. Do you have to be devious?
No, not at all. I think this may have been in the years long gone by. I think now you have to be outspoken. On the contrary, secret diplomacy has practically disappeared. And you talk to people all the time, just as I'm speaking on your program now, much more than to kings and their ministers and their secret servants. So that I don't think you have to be devious at all. You have to be very understanding.
Until recently, you were Israeli ambassador to Denmark, but obviously you had other jobs before that. What sort of things did you do up to being ambassador?
Well, I had served in my own ministry. I served as the director of the information department, director of the public relations department. I was first secretary at our embassy in Washington. Very few people realized that that was a diplomatic title and wanted to know whether I was the ambassador's best typist, being the first secretary. Then I went to New York as consul, which was most interesting. And after having been away at that period for over 7 years, I came home and wanted to have some real life experience other than the foreign service, and became a member of Tel Aviv City Council for 4 years, which I found most interesting and certainly most useful afterwards in Copenhagen.
I understand you were on the cultural committee at this time, and you're responsible for the city's fight against illiteracy and for a new program for adult education. Is this something that was desperately needed at that time?
It was, and unfortunately still is. We have so many immigrants from Muslim countries where we discover that whereas the men have had a fair degree of education, the women are practically illiterate in any language. It's not just that they don't know Hebrew, they can't read and write in any language, which makes it very difficult for them to adjust to modern society. For one thing, they lose their authority over their children, and in these families, paternal authority is terribly important. Secondly, they can't cope with modern government, they can't cope with the welfare state. They go to the local clinic, they get a chit of paper that tells them to go to the pharmacy or to go to a specialist. They don't know what it says. So we must somehow make literate women out of them, teach them the essentials of geography, of arithmetic, and so on and so forth. We're still at it, and you may know, for instance, that we use the girls during their military service to a very large extent to go out into outlying districts and teach these illiterate women to read and to write. You can hardly do it in a classroom. You have to invade the privacy of their homes to do it.
How do they live? What are their homes like?
The homes are all right because we provide all newcomers with fairly decent homes. The question is, what do they do with these homes? Some of them come out of caves and of other primitive dwellings, and some of them live differently from us, but not necessarily worse. You know, that's also something you must understand. People in Asia sleep on the floor and are very happy sleeping on the floor. That's why the Persian carpets have become so beautiful. Now, there is no point forcing a bed on them because this is not really what they need. They have other demands. And but there too, one must be very understanding.
It must be difficult coping with this sort of dual society that you have.
Well, we must make it one society ultimately, but it doesn't pay to make it in the first generation. And our hope is our children. There we mix everybody in the schools, and whoever we don't catch in the school, we catch in the army.
Well, let's come on to your life as an ambassador now. One imagines, I think, that the life of an ambassador in a country like Denmark is a round of gay parties. I'm sure it isn't. Can you tell us, perhaps, if there is such a thing as a typical day, what a typical day might contain?
Well, let's put it this way. Certainly, in as much as the gay parties exist, they're not terribly important. And there are less and less of them. Fortunately, the Danes don't like cocktail parties, and so one had many dinner parties, which were rather pleasant because one could conduct some kind of intelligent conversation. But what one does, of course, is one has an office, one has staff, one has to listen to their problems, one has to read lots and lots of newspapers, the local ones and those from your own country and the international press, to know what is going on. One would perhaps spend a morning going to the Foreign Ministry or the Ministry of Transport to try and negotiate. We never succeeded in that one. An air agreement that would concern their airline or yours. Or one would have to go out of town and open an exhibition of Israel, Land of the Bible, Land of the Future. That would happen in a fairly ordinary day. One would go off and do a thing like this, or one would go and address a trade union foreign policy club on the problems of the Middle East, or one would see some of one's own citizens who for one reason or another are in Copenhagen. This is a blessing in a way. It makes one's life a bit difficult. Copenhagen is a convention and conference city, and one finds oneself trying to make hotel reservations for all these VIPs, and to entertain them I finally devised a scheme of having open house every Friday night. And whoever came, I would say, well, won't you drop in Friday night? And they felt important coming to see their ambassador. And I could just about manage to keep those Friday nights free and see all of these people, which was, it was fun in a way, but sometimes there were just a few too many of them.
I can imagine they didn't always mix together.
And, you make them mix somehow, and of course of necessity you invite some of your own Danish friends and mix it that way. I must say the last year was very rewarding because all of one's friends sent their children to visit. This is a great thing in Israel. The parents try as much as if and when they can, between their leaving high school and joining the army, to give them a chance to see a bit of Europe. And so great numbers of young people turned up, and I always told them that they could use the bathroom and the washing machine, and that was really what they needed.
That sounds rather fun. Are there many Israeli people resident in Denmark? Did you have to deal with their day-to-day problems too?
We have had quite a number of young Israelis, Jewish and Arab, by the way, living in Denmark and working in Denmark, with quite a number of consular problems, and no two consular problems are ever alike. And when the younger people on my staff didn't quite know what to do, they would come to me, and I, who had been a consul in New York before, was quite well versed. In New York, the police would always say to me when I got very worried about some such thing, they would say, Miss Herlitz, it happens to the whole world, but everything with you happens the first time in 2,000 years.
We talked before about the qualities needed for the diplomatic service. We didn't particularly talk about it in relation to women. In your own country, of course, women play a very important role. You have a woman prime minister, as we know. Are women totally equal in Israel?
They are totally equal under the law. That does not necessarily mean that they're totally equal in society. My own feeling is that we are fighting traditions here which have existed since the image of Eve. So that's some good 5,000 years, I suppose. And it is not so easy to have the world accept modern women for what they are, and there has been an immense change in the status of women in these last 10 or 20 years, I suppose. And there is still things to be desired in Israel as well. We certainly don't have enough women in politics, neither locally nor nationally. We perhaps don't have quite enough women active in the trade union movement and in high positions in the government. It's a matter of education and it's a matter of attitudes, and that one doesn't solve by legislation. We have all the legislation, including that of equal pay for equal work. But there I must say one must push along all the time. The fact that there is a woman prime minister has great moral value in that respect, and we hope that we can push along not only the Jewish women but also the Arab women. If I may for a minute talk about a Muslim woman who is the wife of the mayor of the city of Nazareth, who 15 years ago, when I invited her to come to my home, was told by her husband that he would bring her to me. That's to say, she was not to travel alone even in the country. Well, I'm happy to say that this woman visited me in Copenhagen alone, without her husband, because she herself went to a meeting of the Committee on the Status of Women of the United Nations. Now, this is a revolution in 15 years. This is half a generation. It is very, very remarkable. Now, again, it is not all the Arab women who have achieved that much, but this woman, too, being as prominent as she is, sets a certain standard, and I think sets the other women and their husbands thinking that the role of women must and can be different from what it has been.
Do you have women's organizations in Israel, like our Townswomen's Guild, that sort of thing?
Yes, oh yes, we have quite a number of women organizations. We have a Women's Zionist organization, and we have a very interesting thing in that all the members of our trade unions are in their own rights members of the trade union with voting privileges. And that is a very, very large organization with great merit, actually.
We slightly went off the tack because I was going to ask you what you think a woman can bring to the diplomatic service that perhaps a man can't.
Well, I think that women has a lot of intuition, and this is very, very important in the modern diplomacy, where you have to evaluate just how far you can go with the country to which you're accredited, and even with your own country. There are limitations on both sides, and women perhaps have a bit of a sense of humor that helps them along a difficult situation. So both of these qualities are very, very important in the day-to-day running of an embassy and of the negotiations with governments and with organizations with which one has dealings.
You're now no longer ambassador in Denmark. You're a sort of floating ambassador, I gather. What does this entail?
Well, actually, it is a public relations thing which I've been doing. I have been on a speaking tour to Australia and New Zealand, and I'm now touring England and the Republic of Ireland, where I give speeches as I go along and try to evaluate the public opinion, what people think about the Middle East, what they know about the Middle East. I try to tell them what I think, hopefully, a peaceful solution to the problem of the Middle East is.
Mm-hmm. Can you tell us that or not?
Well, I think that it is very obvious that it is our considered opinion that any peace solution must be freely negotiated without prior conditions. But I think that we've gone a little further than that, and that we now feel, in view of our experience with our Jordan border, where we've kept the bridges open quite deliberately, and perhaps against the advice of some of the security people, that the open bridges which have let not only produce and merchandise get across, but also human beings, including almost 100,000 Arab tourists this summer, has created, if not peace, then a state of peace. That we should perhaps try the same enterprise on the Suez Canal, have it reopened for navigation, free navigation of all nations, and we are ready, believe it or not, to withdraw some of our troops, or most all of our troops, from the immediate neighborhood of the canal to make it possible for the Egyptians to revitalize the canal. This is a kind of solution that's been practiced actually in Europe, where there is still no peace between the Allies and the Germans, and yet there has been a state of peace for so long that Willy Brandt even gets the Nobel Peace Prize for it. So maybe if it has been as difficult as it has been all these years to go from total war to total peace, it might be a good idea to do it in stages, and this is why you will find us come up with these partial or interim solutions, if only to unfreeze the situation and prove to our Arab neighbors that a state of peace would be of great advantage to them as it will to us.
It's going to be a slow build, obviously. It sounds like it.
It will take longer. I think that we must realize that historical developments are not instant produce. They take some time to develop.
Well, perhaps we can end on a lighter note, Ms. Herlitz. What does a diplomat do in her off times?
Well, this is, of course, very, very personal. I try to read. I play a bit of golf when I get the time. That takes rather a lot of time. I listen to music. I go to concerts and to theater. And I try to see some of my friends. And it keeps one quite busy. One must have time to oneself.
You have a very busy life.
Yes, I do. And I knit.
And do you enjoy your life?
Very much indeed. I couldn't do it in any other way.